Hello, everyone. This is Ivory, Louisiana Cannabis Nurse Navigator, coming to you guys today just to talk about cannabis and, of course, following the politics. So I realized that I always say follow the politics, and I just thought that today I'll take a few minutes to talk about how I actually follow the politics, what tools I use, and some of my resources and some of the things that I see as I'm following the politics. So, for those who may not know me, or this may be your first time joining in, I'm not sure where you're joining from. I am a registered nurse. I am a cannabis nurse advocate, and I have discovered a profound interest in the politics um, as we are on this road to hopefully legalization. So, as a nurse in general, I realize that we practice the practices that we have in place, the policies, the procedure, even the healthcare laws that we have in place. Those were put in place for the most part, probably before you even started your career, before I started mine for sure. But they govern the way we practice now. So the things that we do now in our practice as a nurse, um, whereas was determined a long time ago for most instances. Well, that's what makes to me cannabis nursing just a unique industry and a unique space, and the timing is perfect to be in because right now everything is shaping, and we have an opportunity to be a part of that process. And I just think that that's so interesting, in this emerging field, that we can actually have an input and kind of shape, um, do our part to shape cannabis practice. So, a lot of times you may see things on social media, you may see things misconstrued, you may see, um, people may misstate something on social media in regards to cannabis or marijuana or whatever the situation is. And I find myself a lot of times going in, typing something, correcting it, or providing a helpful, factual resource that can help somebody, because a lot of times there's a lot of information out there, and a lot of people may not know, a lot of the things that's going on in the cannabis space. So I realized that in order to be an advocate, really a true advocate, you got to know what's going on, and you kind of got to know it inside and out, because I'll show in a little bit, an article that I was reading, and we'll talk about how when you look at the article from the title of the article, um, it's kind of contradictory in a way to what's actually in the article. But we'll talk about that, a little bit later on. I just wanted to give you that, update. So today we are, I'll share one of the trackers that I use, a tool that I use, and of course you guys have had an opportunity in the comments to share if there's anything that you use or you find helpful. I'm always up for new things. So let me pull my screen up. Okay, so I've introduced myself. Part one, if you guys have not already had a chance to look at part one, we talked about international cannabis law or international cannabis policy and the things that's going on the international, level with the United Nations and all of the other countries. So if you haven't had a chance yet, be sure to go back and look at part one, because it's a lot of moving parts, with in international cannabis policy. Um, Part two, we pretty much talked about, the push for federal decrim. We talked about the MORE Act. Um, we talked a little bit about where our elected officials, currently stand. At that time, we talked also about, Senator Kamala Harris. She was newly, announced as the VP nominee, the presidential VP nominee. So we talked about her, impact on cannabis policy moving forward, and we talked about a little bit of some of the latest research. Today we will talk about, a few more policies, that's been going on as I'm following, the latest and the greatest in the cannabis news. But today we'll talk about, the Medical Research Act, the MORE Act, the States Act. And we'll talk a little bit again about where some of our elected officials stand. And most importantly, the part that I think that's most importantly is we will talk about what we can do to impact change. I think that that's very key for us as nurses, as advocates. In this space, we need to be figuring out what can we do to impact change and shape policy moving forward. So, like I said earlier about important tools, one of the trackers that I use is called Congress.gov. So it's a bill tracker pretty much, and it's a reliable tracker. At first, I didn't find it to be user friendly, but of course, with time, as I use it so often, I am finding that it is quite user friendly. I'm always open for new tools, so if you guys have any trackers or bill trackers or anything like that to help you keep up with the bills, I would like to hear from you. Please be sure to include it in the comments. Also, the other tool is Normal. Normal is just a good resource. And we won't too much talk about Normal. Well, we won't talk about Normal in this series. I probably will cover that more so in the next one. So I'll give you my contact information and make sure you subscribe to my channel to make sure so you can get the alert when we talk about Normal in the next series. But for today, we will pretty much go and do like a little overview into Congress.gov. So let me see if I can bring that up. I think it's here. Okay. So here's the screen for Congress.gov. It's a busy screen here. It has a lot of information. But here's just the main toolbar, of course, where you will put your bill. And of course, it has like a little filter here where it can help you search. One of the things that I like about this tracker is it allows you to see the top 10 view bills. So if you click on it, let's see what it brings up. It's still pulling it up. Let's see. The top 3 right here, anyway, it shows you the HEROES Act, condemning all forms of anti-Asian sentiment. I'm sorry, I'm outside in this sun. It's been a pleasant day all day, and now the sun is coming out. And the CARES Act. But anyway, as you can see, if you click on the top 10 normally, yeah, here it is. The top 10 bills will come up. So that's kind of like a good little something to kind of let you see what people are looking at and what's on people's mind, what they're tracking. What is another something that I like about this tracker? It allows you to see current legislative activities. So if there's ever a session or something that's going on and you want to live stream it here, you can do that. It breaks it down by the House and by the Senate. And it has a lot of other just unique little things that you can come on here to just get the latest and the greatest information. If you don't know who your member of Congress is, it has a friendly tool here. You can put your state and you can put you can search it by the House or the Senate for your representative. When you come in here, I think we talked about the Medical Research Act. So if you guys paid attention to that a few weeks ago, the Medical Research Act it came up before the committee. I can't remember which committee, but maybe we can bring it up here. It's saying for whatever reason that my browser doesn't like this Congress.gov. Let's see. The Medical Research Act was brought up in the committee. I think it actually went out of the committee, and now we're just waiting on it to go before the House floor to be voted on before it goes to the Senate. But here is a little bit, and there's a lot of acts. So a lot of times I have to keep up with the actual bill number, which is right here. And this particular research act is 3797, because as you can see, it's a lot of them. But this is the one, 3797. And just right here on the main screen gives you a lot of information. It tells you who the sponsor is. It tells you, a drop down menu for who are the co-sponsors. And it tells you the committees. And what I like about it too is it tells you, it has a little tracker here. So it tells you that pretty much it's still in the introduce phase of the legislation. So it hasn't yet passed the House, but it, of course, once it passed the House, it'll show you, it'll track it here. But it also gives you all of the actions that have been done so far with the bill. And the latest action. So it was introduced last July, and then all the way up to as late as last month. Several committees have looked at it in their committee reports. So that bill, we're pretty much waiting on it to go before the House, and then of course before the House, after the House, it goes before the Senate. What I found unique about this bill, traditionally you'll see with cannabis legislation, it's sometimes just depending, you'll find in these different bills that some of them are heavily bipartisan and some of them are not. And so that's another reason why I follow the politics. I'm gonna bag up, you guys, because this sun is now starting to come down. So we are in true Louisiana form. Okay, so that's better. So some of these bills are more bipartisan than the others. And you'll find it as we're searching through these different bills. Some of them have a lot of support, bipartisan support, and some of them don't. So it forces you, for me, that wants to, me, I want to follow the politics. It makes me think, well, why, does one bill have so much bipartisan support and the other one does not? And when you really get to looking in the weeds, you'll find out real quick why some of them have bipartisan support and what's holding up some of the others. So anyway, just to give a little more information on this bill, since we're in it, the Medical Research Act. Normally, the summary, it'll give you like a summary. It's been saying this for a while, summaries in progress. But normally it'll give you a good description of the bill. And we'll look at that on another bill where the summary is completed. This one, for whatever reason, remains in progress. And I think when you click text, I just click text. I think, yeah, that's just the whole bill. Like, so if you really want to look at the actual bill, you can click text and see all of that. So anyway, you have all of these little options you can choose from. One of the things that I like is you can get alerts. So if you click here and get alerts, the first thing, though, of course, that you would need to do is to register your account or to sign up for an account. So right here, I already have an account, but I'm not logged in right now. But you can get an account. Once you have an account established, you can, whatever bills of interest, you can click here and get alerts. So anytime something happens or they update the website, you will get an email alert, which is another good way to follow the politics. Because you're always in the loop. One thing about this bill too, so let's look at this one to see if it has bipartisan support, and if so, how much. So that bill again is HR. Of course, HR stands for House of Representatives with the bill number. And let me go down. Oops. So I want to click here to see how much support it has or who's supporting the bill. So I clicked on co-sponsors. So this will tell me who all co-sponsored and when they signed on as a co-sponsor. And if you look over here to the far left, it breaks down the co-sponsors. How many of them are Republican? How many of them are Democrat? And so as you can see here, this bill is pretty bipartisan. It has a lot of bipartisan support. 12-9 is pretty good. If you look right up under that, it tells you which states. So out of those 21 people, 21 co-sponsors, it tells you which states are represented. So of course, if your state is not listed here, like mine, I need to be contacting my representatives to figure out, if they are going to support, you know, this bill or not moving forward. Now, of course, this is just the co-sponsors. It hasn't been brought before a vote yet, but this just gives you a breakdown of the representation of the co-sponsors for the Research Act. So let's just remember that. I'm going to write that down. So the Research Act is 12-9 bipartisan support. And the sponsor, I believe, is Representative Earl Blumenauer, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He is very huge in the. I want to say Representative Blumenauer is the chair of the Cannabis Caucus. So you'll see his name a lot when it deals with cannabis. He's a heavy proponent, and we are excited to have him. So that's a little bit about the Medical Research Act. When you click on here, and let's go to the MORE Act, because we hear a lot about the MORE Act, and that's really what I wanted to talk about. Because one of the things I'm becoming increasingly concerned about is people are saying MORE Act, MORE Act, but do you really know what's in the MORE Act? And I think as advocates in this space, we need to be familiar with what's in the MORE Act, because we need to be able to speak to it. If someone is speaking for it or whatever that issue is, or if they're not in favor of it, we need to be able to speak to what's the importance of the MORE Act and what it is and what it isn't. So the MORE Act, and I may have to spell that out actually, because the MORE Act stands for Marijuana Opportunity. Let's see if that's good enough. Okay, so right here, Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act of 2019. So this is what I really want you to pay attention to. This is the House version. So the House version of the MORE Act is, that bill number is 3884. But there's also a Senate version of the MORE Act. And so the Senate version is 2227. So just pay attention to that. I don't know, one of them is spelled out, MORE is spelled out, and then in the Senate it's just MORE. But anyway, one of them, the House has its own bill number, the Senate has its own bill number, and both of them are interesting bills. So just a quick glance at the MORE Act, that's the House version of the MORE Act. Here's the sponsor, Representative Nadler, and this bill has 115 sponsors. 115 co-sponsors. You'll see here that it's still in the introductory phase. It hasn't gone anywhere. Last month, September, we were very hopeful that we were going to get a vote. And it was postponed, they said, until November. So the MORE Act is still waiting to move forward. Just a quick glance here at the MORE Act in the Senate. The sponsor of this bill is Senator Kamala Harris, which is why I was saying, if you've looked at part 2 of the series, why I was indicating, we talked in great detail about her being added to the Democratic ticket as a VP nominee, how that advanced the conversation of cannabis, of cannabis, in part, or advanced really the conversation of the MORE Act, because she is the sponsor of the MORE Act on the Senate side. But you will see here on the Senate side, there are only 7 co-sponsors, and we'll break that down in a second, versus here in the House, there are 115. So that's already kind of showing you a little bit of a divide, right? So let's just click this one that's in the House, 115 sponsors, and let's see if any of your representatives are represented as a co-sponsor. So let's break this down over here. Remember, it's 115 co-sponsors. 114 of them are Democratic and 1 Republican. So remember when we talked about the Medical Research Act and we said that was 12-9, 12 Republican, 9 Democrats, and it was very bipartisan? We're already seeing here for the MORE Act, we're not getting bipartisan support. Here are the states, of course, that are represented. And of course, here are the senators, the representatives that are represented. Most of these representatives co-sponsored back in 2019, but you will see back when this bill started getting a lot of traction a few months ago, there were a lot of people, kind of jumped on board at that time. I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom. And from here, you'll see which ones kind of started coming in. We just had another one I didn't realize came in October the 1st out of California. But you'll see here the ones that kind of came in, October, September, August, or whatever of this year. But the majority of them, so this bill has really picked up support, is what I'm trying to say, on the Democratic side, because this is how much support that it has gotten just this year in the last, for the most part, the last month and a half, of support. So that's interesting with the MORE Act. So we're seeing that on the MORE Act, what was it, 14-1? 14-1. So that's not bipartisan for the House version of the MORE Act. So let's go back and look at the Senate version of the MORE Act. And let's look at these 7 co-sponsors and see if there's bipartisan support there. First of all, it's only 7, and all 7 of them are Democratic. So see how it's only a few states on the Senate side. So yeah, we have a lot of work to do in the Senate because we only have 7 co-sponsors, and all of them are Democrat. And so here are the Democratic sponsors, co-sponsors here. So let's just look real quick at the MORE Act, since we're looking at bringing this MORE Act. There's supposed to be a vote in December on the MORE Act. So let's just see what's in it real quick. And so this is another reason why I like this tool. Let's go to the House, because the House is the one that will be bringing it to the floor. And you can go here under summary, and you can get a summary of the bill. And that's what I like about it. So if you guys ever are talking or speaking with someone and you need some concrete, reliable information, here's a good little screenshot. Just a snapshot of information that you can share about what's in the bill. And in short, what the bill, what's in the bill is, as its name states, it talks about marijuana legalization and decriminalization. It talks about reinvestment and opportunities in the communities that were destroyed by the war on drugs. And it talks about expungement of records for those that were affected, in short. And one of the ways that it will reinvest is by way of taxation on cannabis. So here are the different, basically the main points of what's in the bill per se. Of course, if you press text will actually bring up the bill. And I'm sorry, I don't know why this thing is moving crazy today. What else is important? I guess that's pretty much it. Of course, if you press action or all actions, it'll tell you what's been done on the bill so far. And really, the bill was introduced July 23rd of last year. And then it was pretty much referred out to each of these committees. That was July 23rd of last year. and pretty much it hasn't been that much movement other than I think it passed one of the subcommittees. And yeah, the Judiciary Committee did a markup November of last year, and nothing has happened since then. So that's why back in August, I believe it was during the same time that Senator Harris, who is the author um, or the main sponsor of the bill for the House, when she got selected as the VP nominee, that's when everything started coming back up about the MORE Act, because wasn't nobody, nobody was talking about the MORE Act since November of last year. So that's where we are on the MORE Act. Um, so the House side don't have Democratic support for the most part. It's 14-1. The Senate side is 7-0. But while we're here, let's look at who the sole Republican supporter of the MORE Act is, since it's one. Let's see who that is. Okay, so here, I was trying to see if it would let me know there, but no. Let me come back over here. So it brings up the 115, and then I can go to the left-hand side and press the one person, and it brings up who the one person is, and that's Representative Matt Gaetz. So you would think, okay, we at least we have one on board, right? Matt Gaetz is a Republican who supports the bill, and he's a co-sponsor. Later on, we'll talk about Mr. Gaetz a little bit more and what his position is. And spoiler alert, his comments are a little frightening to say he's a co-sponsor of a bill, but we'll talk about that more a little bit later. So I think I pretty much covered the bills that we need to talk about. Let's exit out of here because it don't want to work anyway. And let's go back to the PowerPoint. So here we will do a recap of the bills. So we talked about the medical research bill. We talked about the MORE Act. We talked about that it's one on the Senate side as well as one on the House of Representatives. So here, just as a recap, I think when I did this, it was only 8 Democrats, but now it's 9. So that's good to know because these things change by the day. You'll have people adding on, coming on board. So for the Medical Research Act, we do have bipartisan support. That bill should be headed to the House. It was marked up in early September. It's important to note as a footprint or a footnote, is that the marijuana research bill is being led by an unlikely duo of pro legalization Representative Earl Blumenauer. Remember I told you he's the chair of the Cannabis Committee, and Representative Andy Harris. So Representative Andy Harris is not a proponent of medical cannabis legalization. I'll say that. And as you saw on the House side for the MORE Act, it was one Republican that supported the MORE Act on the House side, and that was Representative Gaetz. Representative Andy Harris was not one of them. So that's something just to keep in mind. So just from looking at Representative Harris' standpoint, he supports medical research, but he's not there yet for the MORE Act. So just keep that in mind. So we talked about the MORE Act on the House side, the lead sponsor being Senator Harris. No action so far by the Senate, and we don't have bipartisan support. And then on the House side, it was marked up. I think this was marked up last year in 2019. I think this is a typo. This was marked up in 2019. November of 2019. And it was supposed to be scheduled for a vote um, this month or last month. It's been a while since I did the screen, as you can see, because a lot of stuff has changed. It's no longer scheduled for a vote. And the bipartisan support, if there is bipartisan support, is, I don't have my numbers down, but I know it was 115. So it must was 114 to 1. So we've had 7 more Democrats sign on to it. So that's just a brief recap. So the reason why I say watch what they say and what they do, because they will say they are in favor or they're going to vote for the bill, but you also got to go further than that. So it's important to watch what they say and watch what they do as we fight for social justice, you know, in as part of the Decrim bill, because legalization is not just legalization, in my opinion. It's about repairing the community that was harmed from how we got here, you know, from the for the fact of this not being, you know, cannabis being prohibited for so long and the impacts that it has had, the war on drugs and everything associated with that. So now that as a country, we, for the most part, 2/3% of the country is saying, okay, now we're for legalization. That doesn't mean that 2/3% of the country is also for repairing the harms that were done by the war on drugs. So in our fight for social equity, let me move my screen up a little bit. There are 2 representatives, Representative Representative Don Young, as well as Representative Tom McClintock. They in mind you, Representative Don Young is the co-chair. He's one of the co-chairs of the Congressional Cannabis Caucus. So again, this is a co-chair of the Congressional Cannabis Caucus. And when he was asked by a reporter, he was doing a podcast or some type of interview, and he was asked about the MORE Act. And he's the Congressional Cannabis Caucus co-chair. The reporter noted that Young seemed to somewhat misstate his primary objective, stating that it would decriminalize cannabis when it would actually deschedule it entirely. So he misstated what is actually in the MORE Act. So what the reporter is basically saying is, it's hard to understand how you will misstate what's in the MORE Act, and you are the Congressional Cannabis Caucus co-chair. Representative Young said, quote, "It's a big vote and we're going to pass that. I'm confident. What'll happen with it after that?" I guess he means when it goes to the Senate. What will happen to it after that? I don't know. I want to believe that when people vote on something, as they did in the state of Alaska, we ought to recognize the people's will and follow through with it. So I put him here under the title of the fight for social equity, because I just have my eyebrow raised as to how somebody who is the co-chair of the Congressional Cannabis Caucus could misstate what's in the MORE Act. So I find that very concerning, and I don't know if it was intentional or not, or if it was a mistake, but it makes one ponder, you know, the mistake. Representative Tom McClintock said, and quote, "I intend to vote yes on the bill." He said, "With respect to timing, I do find it ironic that the only small businesses the Democrats seem to be worried about is cannabis shops, but I would support this bill whenever it's brought." So if you've been following the politics, we're not really talking about the HEROES Act right now, but one of the sticking points that was in the HEROES Act is because it couldn't get support, or didn't get a lot of support, because Republicans' position on it was that there was too much focus in regards to cannabis in the HEROES Act versus actually job protection. So Mr. Representative McClintock is pretty much referencing that. This is his reference as well, that I'm going to support this bill, meaning the MORE Act, but I'm going to also throw a little shade and say that the only thing that the other party seems to be worried about is cannabis shops. So you have, what I'm showing you here is that even with people, when people are saying yes, or they're agreeing to vote for the MORE Act, it's almost like they have to preface it or give an excuse to why they're supporting it. And it makes you wonder why, because I didn't see those comments from people doing that with the Research Act. The Research Act just got bipartisan support, and you either voted for it, or you're in a co-sponsor of it, or you're not. But for whatever reason, it seems like with the MORE Act, people that are even in support of it, people that are even the congressional co-chair of the Cannabis Caucus, or people who are the sole Republican co-sponsors, feel as though they have to preface their yes vote. I find that to be interesting. So, Representative Matt Gaetz, and this is why I always say you have to, or we should be, reading past the headline, if you will. Read past the headline, because sometimes the headline just gives straight matter of fact answer or phrase. But when you actually read into the article, you find more information. And I can honestly say, as disappointed as I was of Representative Matt Gaetz' position, I've come to be appreciative of his honesty, I guess, because it allows me to see where we're moving and where we're going with this, where we're going with the legislation. Because I think that he speaks for a lot of more people than those who may not have already came out on a statement and said something. So anyway, Matt Gaetz, he is the sole GOP co-sponsor of the bill. Remember, I showed you that when we looked at the House version of the MORE Act. He was the one Republican that was supporting it, and he's the sole GOP co-sponsor. So anyway, this article reads, GOP congressmen will vote yes on marijuana legalization despite reparations concerns. So that kind of says, okay, I'm gonna vote yes for it. Excuse me, I have an airplane flying. That says, yes, I'm gonna vote for it. However, there is a reparation concern. But when you really read in the article, he really has a real concern. Like, he goes all the way in, and it's just like, oh my God, if other people have as much concern as you have, Representative Gates, I don't see how this bill is gonna pass. So what he says, and I quote, I believe in cannabis reform. I believe in cannabis reform in this country. The federal government has lied to the American people for a generation about cannabis. So he says, A, I believe in reform. B, I'm acknowledging that the federal government has lied to the American people about cannabis. Okay. He says, quote, I think the war on drugs was uniquely harmful to urban communities, to communities of color, and I think that some, which I find that word to be very quantitative, some restorative justice for people that saw just extended convictions or that are currently serving extended time in prison ought to be visited through legislation. So I support that. So my question is, as I have it highlighted here, extended. I think that's important. That's an important word to look at. He said something else. Oh, some. When he said, I think there's some restorative justice. Well, what does that mean, for one? And that he feels like people that have extended convictions or people that have served an extended amount of time. Well, I have a problem with that, because if you're somebody that went to jail, just say if you went to jail and you served time, is a year considered extended, or is that not long enough? Do you have to serve 20 years in jail for this plant in order for you to be due restorative justice? Or if you served a year, was that, like, I don't know if a year or 2 years or 5 years or even 10 years is considered extended in his book. My thing is, if it was wrong, it don't matter if you served a day in jail. That was a day too long. Why do those people not need to be made whole? So anyway, these are things that I read, and I just like to share with my audience, for things that I'm reading and that I'm seeing, and just try to challenge us to read past the article. Because if you just read this title of the article, even though it kind of mentions, yeah, he supports it despite reparation, I feel like that's deep, but he goes deeper. So he says, however, so out of the things that we just listed, he says, however, there's a third element that he says is quote unquote doing a little too much. What's doing too much? He says, let me move my screen up. He says, they've, whoever that is, I guess that's the other 114 co-sponsors, because he's the lonely one. So he must be saying those other 114 got money generated for marijuana taxes and revenue essentially being used as reparations for communities of color. And I just don't think that this is the way we ought to stand up industries in this country, that they have to owe some debt to a particular community. But a particular community that they're talking about, Representative Gates, is the community that you previously said that you acknowledged was harmfully impacted. He says, okay, I get it. I mean, a lot of folks in the congressional black caucus, they see marijuana as a substance that ended up with a lot of black kids getting thrown in jail, and now a bunch of white people getting rich off of it. And they resent that. Well, why don't you resent it? But anyway, that that is no reason to create this whole system of redirecting funds as reparation, when really they could fund more research. I go that word again, research. Remember, research was bipartisan. What was it? 12-9. He said, well, really they can fund more research into better medical applications. So he says, I get it. Black kids were thrown in jail, and a bunch of white kids, I'm quoting his words, a bunch of white kids are getting rich off of it. I'm sorry for that, but there's no reason for us to redirect funds as reparations, is what he's saying. The GOP congressman added that he thought some of the federal cannabis tax revenue could instead, quote, fund distribution that would allow more people who need cannabis as medicine to be able to receive it. But a simple solution for that, for the people who need cannabis as medicine, A, you can make the insurances cover it, or B, you could just free the plant, and that will solve that, in my opinion. But you guys, I welcome to hear what you got to say in the comments. So I wanted to just share that. So pretty much, just to recap again, Representative Gates, who is the sole GOP co-sponsor on the MORE Act, is pretty much in short saying that I agree with the M, but I don't agree with the ORE. I don't agree with the opportunity, the reinvestment. Well, I don't think he really talk about expungement, but he definitely don't agree with the O and the R, the opportunity in the reinvestment. Well, he doesn't agree with the reinvestment into the community that was impacted. He agrees in the reinvestment into setting up a fund to allow money for people who need marijuana as medicine. I don't have that article in front of me right now, but I had just read a article a few weeks ago that talked about how many people, especially baby boomers, that are on cannabis. Like, I don't think people realize that there are a lot of people using cannabis, specifically cannabis as medicine. So instead of setting up a fund, like I said, how the insurance is accepted as medicine or free to plant is my train of thought on that. But anywho, so let's see. Gates in his new podcast argued that more modest. So this is Gates coming telling us what he recommends. So instead of this MORE Act that includes reinvestment into the communities of color that were destroyed by the war on drugs, he's coming now giving us a recommendation. So let's listen to the recommendation. And let's listen to the recommendation because he tells us that a lot of his colleagues in the Senate also agrees with his recommendation. So what does he say? He says, he argued that a more modest cannabis reform legislation could pass both chambers of Congress and be signed by the president. He says the strengthening the 10th Amendment through Entrusting States Act, which is the States Act, if you guys have heard of that. Give me 1 second, plugging up my computer. So pretty much the States Act, he said, will simply allow states to set up their own marijuana policies without fear of federal intervention. So it wouldn't formally deschedule cannabis or address past harms of the war on drugs. So you have to understand that this is the same person who is the sole co-sponsor of the MORE Act. This means you really don't support the MORE Act because you're saying, and don't get me wrong, the States Act has its place because, you know, there are 33 states now that has some form of legalization. So I'm not saying that the States Act hasn't been instrumental in moving the ball, but I'm of the position that we're past that. Okay, now it's time. The States Act acted as a band-aid for when the federal government would not act. So the States Act helped to, I don't know if it was the actual States Act, but what I'm trying to say is states being allowed to move forward with cannabis reforms in their state has advanced the ball. So I'm not saying that that doesn't have a place, but in my mindset, because they have advanced the ball and because we've seen the financial impact on the economy, because we've seen the medicinal impact on people that's using cannabis as medicine, to me, that sets up the opportunity now that we should be able to move forward past the States Act because the States Act doesn't go far enough. So for him to say, so let's remind you what's in the States Act. It would simply allow states to set up their own marijuana policies without the fear of federal intervention. Well, we wouldn't be fearing federal intervention if we just decriminalized and descheduled the plant, which is in the MORE Act. So if we passed the MORE Act, we wouldn't have to, but anyway, we wouldn't have to go through the States Act. But anyway, he says, though it wouldn't formally deschedule cannabis it would not formally deschedule cannabis or address past harms of the war on drugs. So essentially what the Cannabis Act will do is what the States Act will do is what's going on now. It just would allow us to go from 33 states doing what we're doing, all individually, everybody have their own rules, and you still will have the federal stuff on your back because depending on what industry you work in, and particularly nursing, is not one of those industries that you will feel, as he said, you can move forward without fear, of federal intervention. Some careers, such as health industry, people that work in law enforcement, or an array of industries, you can't just go willy-nilly like that. It gotta be all or none, to where you got to totally free this plant if you're serious about that. So I just found that to be interesting. That pretty much is what he's saying. Pretty much what he's saying his position is, and really what the States Act is really saying is, let's go from 33 states to all states being able to have a cannabis policy at the state level. He says, so instead, and I'm spending a lot of time on this, you guys, because I feel like I feel like even though what he's saying for me is very frustrating, it, I feel like he speaks for his party. So I think that it's important for us as industry leaders or advocates or wherever we are in this space to understand this thought process, because he's saying it out loud for the people who probably haven't said it yet, but this is the thought process. So this is why I'm spending time dissecting each of these statements. So he said, instead of doing all this restorative justice and all of the reparation, it just does essentially the work of getting rid of the federal government's role in the process. So in other words, what he's saying is, let's just move forward. Let's just legalize it for everybody. Let's forget about the stuff that happened in the past that I've acknowledged that was there. You know, let's forget about all the people that's gone to jail, their records messed up, they may have lost their job, they may can't get their job back, their career may have been destroyed, their reputation may have been destroyed. Let's forget about all of that. Let's just pick up from here and let's just move forward with legalization. Let's not go and correct none of the stuff in the past, even if it's still affecting your community now. Let's not go do that. Let's just pick up and go. He says, quote, that this will largely be a state-based decision. If the state does allow for marijuana under a medical platform, or even, and then let me back up. He says, if. So that tells me that, again, if you live in a state that's not progressive, you still likely not to move forward. This is another reason why it needs to be done on the federal level, because giving these states this discretion, too much discretion, is part of the problem as well. So he says that if a state does allow for marijuana under a medical platform, or even under an adult use platform, they would have the opportunity to do so without being in a direct conflict with current federal law. All of this workaround instead of just working on the federal law. So that brings me to, it really made me start to thinking, is the MORE Act really a gimmick to really end up with the Enhanced States Act? Because that's what it sounds like to me, because you are a co-sponsor for this MORE Act, but I can't tell, because you have pretty much told us you signing off on it and you voting for it, but you don't agree with it. And not only do you not agree with it, you tell us too later on that your colleagues don't agree with it either. So anyway, just the States Act. This bill eliminates regulatory controls and administrative, civil, and criminal penalties under the Controlled Substance Act. It also requires the GAO office to study and report the effects of marijuana legalization on traffic support, on traffic safety. That's the States Act. So other than Gates, I wanted to follow the politics more with the States Act to see who else has this train of thought on the States Act. And I saw that Cory Gardner, which is out of Colorado, in this article, it says that he could use a legislative win because he's trailing in his re-election race. So Cory Gardner, who is a senator from the great state of Colorado, you would not think that if you can't convince him on the MORE Act, he rathers the State Act over the MORE Act. We're in trouble if the senator from Colorado feels that way, because the States Act is a long ways from MORE Act. So I'm just like, okay, you're in Colorado, you should be the one that's leading this effort. But anywho, Mr. Gardner's um, support is for the STATE Act. And it also said President Trump is also in support of the STATES Act. So President Trump, I think we talked about that maybe in part one, probably in part two, a little bit too, about his different positions or different statements that he's made um, in regards to cannabis. So pretty much here, Representative Gates is saying that Trump supports the STATE Act. I doubt, I don't think he's on the record specifically for the MORE Act, but I don't think that he supports the MORE Act. So I just went through this pretty much with just comparing and contrasting the states and the MORE Act. I think I've beat that out of beat it with a stick. But pretty much the STATE Act too, which is interesting because Cory Gardner is in the Senate, and the STATE Act bill is in the Senate. Cory Gardner and Elizabeth Warren are the lead sponsors for the STATE Act. But even with it being there, it still hasn't been any action on it. And then the last time that I checked, which has been a few weeks ago, it was 9 co-sponsors for the STATE Act. I don't know if that has increased or not, but it was bipartisan. It was so again, the STATE Act is bipartisan, but the MORE Act is not. So that's why in the previous screen, I pretty much asked, is the whole, are we going to end up with just a enhanced States Act versus going for the MORE Act? So that's why I really want you guys to pay attention to the news and pay attention to the politics and know what's in these bills, because you'll think, okay, STATE Act, yeah, we're moving forward, which in a sense we are. I'm not saying that the STATE Act doesn't have some value to it, but when you compare the STATE Act versus the MORE Act is severely more comprehensive. So that's why we really need to be educating and pushing the MORE Act. So what's not in the STATE Act? The main thing is restorative justice. So the STATE Act works to expand cannabis legalization and pretty much keep the Fed off your back. But the main thing that's not in the STATE Act is restorative justice. And so that's why I said that even though Representative Gates' comments were very disheartening, his comments really allowed me to open my eyes to see where we're going. And I should have put a slide in here, and I forgot to put that in here, where not too long after Representative Gates made that comment, Senator Harris came out she came out with a official campaign backdrop, and in the backdrop, it pretty much said that her statement was pretty much in support of the MORE Act, and she was saying that she doesn't agree with doing the MORE Act in increments. And so I pretty much feel like that was, in my mind, a directed at Representative Gates, because like I said, I feel like Gates went all the way there, and I feel like he went on record because he's speaking for his party. He's pretty much telling us where his party feels. And I think that was Senator Harris's, I don't want to say clapback, but that was pretty much her rebut. And what she was pretty much saying is, no, we're not going to do this in increments. We're not going to do legalization, decrim, and then restorative justice. All of this can be in one bill. We just need to do it and move forward. So be looking for that, you guys. STATE Act, a showdown between what's in the STATE Act versus what's in the MORE Act. Because like I said before, we know that there's 2/3 support for legalization. We don't know that, there's not 2/3 support for social justice, restorative justice is what we're seeing, okay? So that's going to be big moving forward. And what's going to even be a bigger piece is those that are even in our cannabis community, that's in this cannabis space and that agrees with cannabis space, are they going to settle is everybody going to be on board for restorative justice? Or people, that's another something. Even people that are in this space, it concerns me when I see some things, because I don't know that everybody is for restorative justice. See, a lot of people haven't really looked at the MORE Act. They say, yeah, more act, because it's cannabis legalization. But I don't think people have really read down into it to see what's in there. And once they read in there, my question is, are they still going to be in favor of it? Once they see the restorative justice, once they see the community reinvestment, um, are they really going to be in favor of it, or are they going to be swayed to go toward the States Act? That's something that we're watching. So I say, what's next? What's next is we're going to talk about, so where do we go from here? It's pretty much what's next. So we're going to talk about, in my next video, I will talk about normal. I do a overview, and normal is not misspelled. That's really how it's spelled. We'll do an overview of normal, because with breaking down to you the States Act versus the MORE Act, as you can see, we're going to really need good support for the MORE Act. So on my next video, I will talk more about normal and how we could be using our voice to try to shore up support for normal. Shore up support for the MORE Act. And I think that's it. So anything that I talked about, which I think mainly I only talked about that one article from from Marijuana Moment with Representative Gates. I think that's really the only reference that I support, that I quoted in this piece. But if any of my other in part one or part two, if you need any of those references, because anything that I put in here, I kind of like keep the article or keep whatever my reference is. So if you want any of that information, feel free to email me and I'll just shoot you over the articles that I have and where I'm quoting my what sources that I'm using and where I'm getting my information from. And so, you guys, I ask that you subscribe, follow, and like me on like our page. And if you can subscribe to Nurse Ivory on YouTube. That way you'll get a notification. Hit the bell, you'll get a notification of whenever I post a video. I'm also at Nurse Ivory on Twitter. And on Facebook and Instagram, I am at LA Canna Nurse Navigator. Also, I am the co-founder of Cannabis Nurses of Color. So we can be found on Facebook as well as Instagram and really Twitter at Canna Nurse CNOC. So thank you guys for joining, and I look forward to you guys coming back. Thanks.